It started innocently, like most mistakes do. I had known Ryan since he was 6 years old. He was the shy kid who always hid behind his mother's legs during gatherings. I was the loud, free-spirited friend who'd bring wine, laughter, and advice to his mother, Denise, my closest friend for over 20 years. I watched Ryan grow from a quiet boy into a confident young man. I never saw it coming. That's the part that still haunts me. Last winter, Denise left the country for a work assignment in Dubai, asking me to keep an eye on the house and her 24-year-old son, who'd just gone through a brutal breakup. I agreed without hesitation. What harm could it do? He reached out one night after midnight, voice low and trembling over the phone. He'd had a panic attack, he said, and didn't want to be alone. I drove over in my pajamas, more out of maternal concern than anything else. But when I opened the door, something in the air changed. His eyes lingered a little too long. He hugged me like he needed something more than comfort. Still, I ignored it, told myself I was imagining things. But it kept happening. Long talks on the couch, confessions at 2 a.m., lingering touches that should have meant nothing. I started looking forward to seeing him. I stopped thinking about Denise. That was my first betrayal. One night, as rain beat against the windows, he asked for a favor. Just a simple one, he said. Can I sleep in your bed tonight? Just sleep. I haven't felt safe in days. I said yes. That night, nothing happened, physically. But emotionally, everything changed. We woke up tangled in each other's arms. No words were exchanged, just breaths. 2 weeks later, we crossed the line fully. It wasn't about lust. It was deeper. We talked for hours after. He told me how I made him feel seen, how he'd always felt a strange pull toward me, one he thought he'd buried. I confessed that I'd felt emotionally invisible in my own marriage for years, that Ryan had unknowingly awakened a version of me that I had put to sleep long ago. What followed was a series of stolen weekends, secret texts, and emotional highs laced with unbearable guilt. I'd cry after being with him, not because I didn't want him, but because I knew I was betraying a woman who'd once held my hand through childbirth. Eventually, Denise came back. Ryan ended it, saying it was for the best. I agreed. We never spoke of it again. Now, years later, I still see her smile in pictures, unaware of the nights her son and I crossed the line between love and loyalty. I carry that weight every day, because not all affairs begin with desire. Some start with loneliness, comfort, and one simple favor. Emotional vulnerability is a strange and powerful force. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or drama, nor does it need a romantic setting to take root. Often it begins in the quiet spaces between grief, confusion, and loneliness, when someone is simply trying to survive the day. In these moments, our need for comfort outweighs our sense of boundaries. We crave understanding, softness, and the warmth of being seen. And when that comfort comes from someone familiar, someone trusted, the line between right and wrong, between platonic care and emotional intimacy, begins to blur almost invisibly. In relationships, especially long-standing ones where trust is presumed, emotional vulnerability can feel deceptively safe. A best friend, a confidant, a surrogate family member. These are the people we lean on during personal crises. But when the dynamic changes, when grief is mutual, or when someone is emotionally adrift, that once solid foundation starts to shift beneath the surface. A shared glance lingers a second too long. A text message feels more intimate than it should. A conversation late at night feels like emotional exposure rather than simple concern. And in that gray space, human connection becomes charged with something it was never supposed to carry. It's not always about seduction, nor is it driven by conscious intent. Sometimes people simply stumble into each other's brokenness. They bond over mutual wounds, divorce, heartbreak, death, loneliness. One listens just a little more closely. One shares just a little more openly. And in doing so, they create a private emotional world that exists outside of social norms. It's not sexual at first. It's sacred. That's what makes it so dangerous, because before anyone even realizes what's happening, emotional dependency grows. And with that dependency, the emotional boundaries, those unspoken lines that separate the appropriate from the forbidden, begin to dissolve. This blurring of emotional boundaries is often mistaken for love, or worse, justified as fate. But in truth, it's a collision of unmet needs. A woman may find herself opening up to someone she's known for years, a friend's son, a younger colleague, a neighbor, because he sees her in a way her partner no longer does. He listens, he notices. He's emotionally available at the precise moment she feels most unseen, and when he reaches out for support, perhaps from his own place of loss or confusion, she responds not as a caregiver, but as someone who's also desperate to be needed. That mutual ache, when answered, feels like a lifeline, but it's really a tether pulling both into deep emotional waters with no lifeguard on shore. Often, by the time they realize the depth of their emotional entanglement, the damage is already done. Not because they've slept together, but because they've already imagined it. Because their hearts race at the sound of a text notification. Because they withhold parts of the connection from others. Because it suddenly feels like a secret. That secrecy alone marks the beginning of betrayal. It's no longer about a simple bond of care. It becomes a space where emotions are nurtured in hiding, where what should be shared with a partner is now shared with someone else. And in many ways, emotional infidelity cuts deeper than physical betrayal, precisely because it feels more honest, more profound. The tragic irony is that emotional vulnerability, the very thing that brings people together in authentic ways, can also become the gateway to deep regret. What starts as empathy becomes chemistry. What starts as comfort becomes temptation, and by the time boundaries are acknowledged, they've often already been crossed. The guilt that follows isn't just about hurting someone else, it's about betraying oneself. About realizing you were capable of crossing a line you once judged others for. Emotional vulnerability doesn't just blur boundaries, it tests identity. It forces people to confront the parts of themselves they thought were safe from impulse, from desire, from need. This isn't to say vulnerability is something to be avoided. On the contrary, it's what makes us human. But when it arises in the context of intense emotional connection outside a primary relationship, especially with someone who should be off limits, it demands self-awareness, restraint, and honesty. Because left unchecked, emotional vulnerability becomes fertile ground for blurred lines, misplaced attachment, and secrets that cannot be undone. In the quiet places where love is absent and comfort feels like a gift, many people find themselves asking the same question too late. How did we get here? Would you like the next keynote expanded in a similar way? Longing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It lingers quietly in the background of day-to-day life, unnoticed but ever present, like a low hum beneath a seemingly calm exterior. It can begin so subtly that it barely registers at first, emerging in fleeting glances, a shift in tone, or a moment of hesitation before saying goodnight. Silent longing is often born out of unmet emotional needs, buried desires, and the deep human craving to be seen, understood, and wanted. It grows slowly, feeding on small interactions that, on the surface, seem harmless. A compliment that lands differently, a look that holds just a second too long, or the way someone says your name like it actually matters. When two people orbit close enough to touch, yet remain just out of reach, the distance becomes charged. That emotional electricity doesn't require permission. It builds on its own, gathering strength in the quiet moments. The longing begins to fill in the silence. When you miss their voice after a long day, when you check your phone hoping they've messaged, when you replay a conversation just to hold onto the feeling it gave you. What was once casual starts to feel essential. What was once incidental now feels intentional. You notice the way they smile at you differently than at others, or the way your mood shifts the moment they enter the room. The connection becomes the center of gravity, pulling your focus, no matter how much you try to redirect it. Often, this longing begins in relationships where nothing physical has happened, and that's precisely what makes it so intoxicating. There's a purity to it, a sense of innocence that disguises the danger. You can tell yourself you haven't done anything wrong because you haven't touched, kissed, or confessed, and yet the emotional charge speaks louder than any action. You start to dress with them in mind. You wonder what they think of you. You seek their validation when you once never needed it. And in that process, your emotional world quietly reorganizes itself around them, piece by piece. It doesn't always require shared vulnerability either. Sometimes just being seen can awaken a part of you that's been dormant. Maybe they ask you a question no one else bothers to. Maybe they remember something you said offhand 3 weeks ago. Maybe they look at you in a way that makes you feel new again. That kind of attention, especially when you've been starved of it, can be a drug. You begin to light up in their presence. You become more animated, more alive, even when you're trying not to be. And all the while, you tell yourself it's harmless, that it's just friendship, that these feelings are only in your head. But longing doesn't stay silent forever. It gathers weight, tension, and urgency. Eventually, it demands to be named, and when it isn't, it finds other ways to speak. Through body language, tones, silences that feel loaded, conversations that last a little too long. One person says something that borders on confessional, and the other doesn't stop them. A touch lingers, an inside joke feels like intimacy. Suddenly, the unspoken becomes louder than any declaration ever could. You both know what's happening, even if you're pretending not to. This silent longing is complicated by the reality that it's often mutual. You see it reflected back at you, and that reflection affirms the bond. You realize they feel it too, and that shared tension creates its own emotional world, one where rules bend and boundaries blur. You become fluent in each other's moods, drawn to private moments, hooked on what's unspoken. You begin to rely on that connection, and with each passing interaction, you build a silent agreement that neither of you will name it, because naming it makes it real. And real means consequences. For people already in relationships, this is where the guilt begins to seep in, not because they've acted physically, but because they know they would, if given permission, if the moment allowed, if the risk didn't outweigh the craving. Silent longing becomes a test of restraint, one that slowly erodes self-control. It wraps around your thoughts, coloring everything else in your life. You compare your partner's attention to theirs. You measure your day by the moments you do, or don't, interact. You feel distant from your existing life, even as you try to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The pain of silent longing is that it's both beautiful and unbearable. It offers you a glimpse of something profound while keeping it just out of reach. And once it turns loud, once it spills into action, it rarely returns to silence, because longing once named changes everything. The emotional innocence you once clung to vanishes, and what remains is the raw truth of desire, undeniable, messy, and real. Would you like me to expand the third keynote next? Guilt doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, often just after the moment has passed, after the words have been spoken, the touch has lingered too long, or the boundary has been crossed under the disguise of something harmless. It begins as a flicker, a quiet discomfort that you try to explain away. But guilt has a way of lingering in the corners of your mind, no matter how much you try to rationalize the choices that brought it on. And when the bond in question involves someone off limits, like the child of a best friend or a person you were never meant to see in that way, it becomes more than just guilt. It becomes a betrayal laced with emotional complexity, tangled in the threads of loyalty, love, and personal conflict. Loyalty is often the moral compass that keeps us grounded. It tells us where our allegiances lie, who we must protect, and what lines we should never cross. But loyalty is tested most brutally not when it is threatened externally, but when it collides with internal desire. When the person you feel drawn to is someone you have no right to desire, someone whose very presence in your life is supposed to be protected by a wall of platonic trust, your mind becomes a battleground. You tell yourself it was just one moment. You tell yourself they needed comfort. You tell yourself that you didn't mean for it to go that far. But the truth beneath those stories doesn't go away, and the more you try to suppress it, the more powerful it becomes. When loyalty clashes with emotion, something begins to fracture. You become two versions of yourself, the one who smiles, who plays the role, who maintains appearances, and the one who waits for the next private moment, who watches for subtle signs of recognition, who aches in silence. You begin to compartmentalize your life, carving out emotional space for a connection that can never fully exist in daylight. That duality breeds guilt, not just because of what you're doing, but because of what you're becoming. You see the erosion of your integrity in real time, and yet you keep feeding the fire, hoping it doesn't burn everything down. What makes this kind of guilt so unbearable is that it's not about doing something obviously wrong, like cheating in a moment of passion with a stranger. It's the slow betrayal of someone who trusts you implicitly. In the case of a best friend, it's someone who has likely seen you at your most vulnerable, who has confided in you, who believes you would never do anything to hurt them, let alone with their child. That trust, once broken, can never fully be repaired, and knowing that makes the secret all the heavier. It turns every smile into a lie, every shared memory into a reminder of what you've risked. The guilt isn't just for the act. It's for the deep, almost sacred betrayal of a bond that should have been untouchable. And then there's the forbidden bond itself, the connection you never expected, the one that grew not out of lust, but out of proximity, familiarity, and unmet emotional need. You tell yourself you didn't go looking for it, that it just happened, but that doesn't make it any less real. And that reality is what makes the guilt worse. Because unlike meaningless flings or reckless mistakes, this bond carries emotional weight. You care, you feel, and those feelings don't go away just because you know they're inappropriate. In fact, the very fact that it's forbidden often intensifies the attachment. The secrecy, the urgency, the danger, it all fuels the connection, making it harder to resist and harder to walk away from. You find yourself torn between two kinds of pain, the pain of staying in a morally compromised situation, and the pain of letting go of something that, in another life, might have been beautiful. The longer it goes on, the more isolated you become. You can't talk about it, can't confess it, can't seek comfort for it, because to even speak it aloud is to betray someone you love. So you carry it in silence, letting it rot parts of you that used to be whole. Guilt, loyalty, and forbidden bonds don't operate in isolation. They wrap around each other like vines, suffocating logic and morality. They force you to live in emotional contradiction, to love and betray in the same breath, to protect someone while wounding them in secret. And in that conflict, you lose pieces of yourself. You become a stranger to your own values, a visitor in your own life, walking through days that feel like borrowed time. Because deep down you know the truth always surfaces. And when it does, the guilt won't just be yours. It will ripple outward, breaking everything it touches. Would you like me to expand the fourth keynote next? There comes a moment after the secrecy, after the emotional whirlwind and the justifications, when reality settles in. And it never does so gently. The rush is gone. The excitement of the forbidden has faded. What remains are consequences, quiet, heavy, and irreversible. They don't arrive all at once, but in waves. Sometimes they hit with silence, in the stillness of a room where someone no longer looks at you the same. Other times they come through confrontation, through a message, a phone call, or a look of disbelief in the eyes of someone who trusted you completely. And no matter how deeply you felt, how intensely you bonded, how sincerely you cared, what's broken doesn't care about your reasons. It only knows it's shattered. Infidelity, especially the emotionally complex kind that involves emotional entanglement and a deep personal connection, doesn't just risk one relationship. It detonates multiple. In situations where family and friendship overlap, where you've crossed a line with someone who belongs to someone else emotionally, like your best friend's son, the damage radiates outward like ripples in water. It's not just about the two of you anymore. It's about what that bond meant to others, what that trust represented, and how many histories are now rewritten because of what happened behind closed doors. One of the first consequences is often the loss of a relationship that once felt like a second home. A best friend is more than a person. They are a history, a sense of safety, an emotional pillar that feels permanent. When that's violated, it doesn't just end the friendship. it reshapes your understanding of who you are. Suddenly, you're not the friend they thought they knew, and even if they never find out, the weight of the truth infects every interaction. You flinch at their kindness, you hesitate when they call, you feel undeserving of the love they offer because deep down you know you've betrayed the very foundation it was built on. That guilt becomes a permanent filter through which you experience every shared moment. Then there's the internal consequence, the emotional fallout that doesn't go away just because the affair ends. It's the slow unraveling of the fantasy you built. You begin to see how much of your happiness was rooted in something unsustainable. You realize that what felt like deep connection was also avoidance, of pain, of loneliness, of responsibilities you didn't want to face in your own life. And as the illusion crumbles, you're left with the raw truth. You acted out of need, not clarity. Out of emotion, not intention, and even if you believed it was real, and maybe it was, it still came at a price. The person you were involved with also carries their own weight. If they're younger, like a friend's son, they may process it with confusion, guilt, or even resentment. What began as connection may leave them burdened with emotional complexity they weren't prepared for. They may question their role in it all. Were they used or did they use you? Did they initiate or did they follow? And even if it felt mutual, the aftermath can leave both parties emotionally stranded, unsure of how to move forward and permanently altered by what they shared. Relationships beyond the core betrayal begin to suffer too. Your marriage or partnership, if you're in one, starts to show cracks you can no longer ignore. The affair might have been a symptom of those cracks, but once it's over, you're forced to confront them without distraction. Conversations become strained, trust becomes fragile. Even if the truth never surfaces, your presence in that relationship changes. You become more withdrawn or defensive. You might overcompensate, trying to regain the moral high ground you lost. But the emotional distance grows, and eventually, you either break under the weight of your silence or become someone your partner no longer recognizes. Even if no one ever finds out, the consequence lives inside you. It alters how you see yourself. You start to question your own values, your own capacity for deception. You remember what it felt like to be someone else for a while, wanted, needed, alive, and now, returning to your previous life feels like stepping into a version of yourself that no longer fits. That dissonance can lead to depression, anxiety, or a kind of emotional numbness that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Some mistakes fade with time. But the kind that breach trust, love, and loyalty in the deepest places don't just leave scars. They reshape the emotional landscape of everyone involved. You carry the weight of what was lost, what can't be undone, and what might have been saved had the truth come sooner. And that burden doesn't always scream, it lingers quietly. In every version of the life, you now have to live without the fantasy that once felt so real. Would you like to turn these keynotes into chapters for a scripted video or emotional voiceover content next?